Hey guys, this is the 13th Java video tutorial, and in this video you will learn how to use default constructor, and also you will learn how to overload a constructor. Okay, but before that, let's just recap. In the last tutorial, in the 12th Java tutorial video, we had these two classes right here, and this class has three instance variables, and these three were initialized using this constructor. Okay, and also we did three get methods or accessor methods. We also had three set methods or mutator methods to set or change the values of the instance variables. And also the last method that we had in the last video tutorial was the toString method. Now toString again returns the string representation of this object, and in the main we just created one object with three pieces of information: the badge number, the name of the student, and the GPA. And then we just simply displayed the objects, the string representation of the object, by just calling the toString. And toString can be implicitly called using the reference to the student object, which is the stud reference variable. Okay, now this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the second object of students. So if I may change the first reference variable to stud1, because I'm going to have the second one, and that one I'm going to name it stud2. Okay, and then to create a new object of student, we have to use the new keyword followed by the name of the class, followed by the parenthesis, a pair of parentheses. And again, by doing this, the constructor is called. Okay, but the problem again, this is underlined because we don't have a constructor that doesn't have any parameters. So remember, if the constructor doesn't have any parameters at all, and that can be called a default constructor. Okay, so if the constructor doesn't have parameters like this, then that constructor must be called a default constructor. Now you can do this. What if you don't want to initialize the objects, okay, with anything? You can leave the parentheses blank. This method calling here may not have arguments. That's fine. If you just want to use the default values, now you can leave these parentheses blank. But remember, if you have a non-default constructor and you have a non-argument constructor calling here, make sure that you have you have to explicitly write a default constructor. Okay, so the line is gone because I just created a default constructor. Now default constructor must be explicitly written if you have a non-default constructor. When we say non-default constructor, the constructor has parameters. So again, this is the non-default constructor, and this is the default constructor. So I have two objects here. The first object I created has three initial values. One one is for the badge number, the second is for the student name, and the third is for the student GPA. But the second object I created is a non-argument construct. I created an object without passing anything, so no arguments at all. Okay, so if this happens, if you do this, it means that the default constructor is called. So remember, if you have a non-default constructor and you create an object without passing anything to the constructor, so you have to explicitly write a default constructor. Okay, that's the rule. But if this is not here, for example, this is not here, and this object creation is not here, then even without explicitly writing a default constructor, that is fine. Because again, like what I said, by default, okay, it is by default. It's non-argument constructor. It's by default. Okay, by default, the constructor is a non-parameter constructor. Okay, so it's okay to not explicitly write a default constructor if there is no non-default constructor written in the class. Okay, so that's the rule. Do not forget that. So let me just put back what I deleted. Okay, so where am I? Okay, so here I'm going to put them back. Okay, now so since I have two constructors here, one default constructor and one non-default constructor. So in other words, I have overloaded constructors, right? Overloaded constructor. One constructor with 3 parameters and one constructor with no parameters at all. So I have two constructors, of course, because these two methods have the same names, like students, but they have different signature. The first one has 3 parameters and the second one has nothing at all, right? So we have what we call here overloaded constructors here, right? Now let's go back to the test, to student test. So let's just test if this class gonna work. Again, the first object was explicitly initialized. So the badge was initialized to 111. The name of the first object was initialized to student1, and the GPA of the first student is initialized to 3.4. But the second object, it was not explicitly initialized. So the Java, gives the value for the badge number for the second student as 0, and Java gives the name to the second student as null, and 0.0 will be given to the GPA for the second object. Now, to prove to you that the second object will have 0, null, and 0.0, let's try to call the toString of the second object just by using the reference variable to the second student object. Okay, let's see. The first one, we will see the first the first set of values are 111, student1, and 3.4, and the second set of values are 0, null, and 0.0. Let's try to run it. Let's see if I'm correct. There you go. So the first value, the first object has 111, student1, and 3.4, because in the main the object was explicitly initialized, okay, by doing this, by having arguments. But the second object, it has default values like 0 for the badge, null for the name, because name is of type string, and string is an object, and the default value for an object is null. And then the GPA for the second object is 0.0, because see the second instantiation here, it is what we call non-arguments. Okay, non-argument instantiation, because the parenthesis, there's nothing inside the parenthesis, right? So when the constructor is called, there must be a default constructor explicitly written, because we have a non-default constructor written in the same class. Okay, so again, this video just showed you how to have a default constructor. What happens if there is a default constructor and the instantiation is done without passing anything to the constructor, and what do you have if you have more than one constructor? Okay, so I hope you learned something from this video, and see you next time. Bye bye.